seat 135,000 spectators. But since then, the track has removed thousands of seats due to declining attendance, leaving the current capacity at about 54,000. Track leaders hope this year's postponed spring race will be rescheduled as a doubleheader with their race this August. From the Delaware desk, WHYY News.
The afternoon forecast, interval of sun and cloud, humid, high all the way to 91 degrees. It's 1:06. This is WHYY.
Support for NPR comes from Heather Stern Hagen and Paul G. Hagen, supporting African Wildlife Foundation, working to ensure the future of Africa's wildlife and wildlands. Learn more at awf.org and Americans for the Arts at americansforthearts.org.
From NPR and WBUR, I'm Jeremy Gibson.
I'm Tanya Mosley. It's Here and Now. This afternoon, Republican Senator Linda Murkowski said the words of former Defense Secretary James Mattis were true, honest, necessary, and overdue.
Mattis shocked Washington yesterday with a scathing criticism of President Trump. He said he was angry and appalled at how the government is handling the nationwide demonstrations against racial injustice and police brutality. The decision to clear peaceful protesters from outside the White House this week, an abuse of executive authority. Let's bring in Here Now security analyst Jim Walsh. He's a senior research associate at MIT Security Studies program. Hi, Jim.
Good to be with you, Jeremy.
And to remind people, Mattis is a Marine general who resigned as Secretary of Defense in December. He made comments in a statement to The Atlantic saying Trump is, quote, the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. How significant are these statements coming from a very respected former military leader?
Yes, I've met with Mattis. I met with him when he was head of CENTCOM. Later, he became Secretary of Defense. I think they're significant, one, because in the main, military officials try to refrain from criticizing the president. Certainly, as people who are not retired try to avoid that, and even the retired military officers strive to do that. And in this case, we have Mattis making a statement, we have others who have made statements, and more tellingly, we've had statements from people in the military, acting commanders, who have issued official statements basically expressing concern about the protests and about police brutality and those sorts of things. That's very unusual for them to be making statements on what are domestic issues. And I interpret both Mattis's statements, Mullen's statements, other people's statements, and these statements from active military as signaling, saying, hey, we're concerned about this. This might be moving in the wrong direction, and it makes them feel uncomfortable.
Well, that's the Mullen, as you were talking about, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, who made some statements against what the president is doing. Also, retired General John Allen, the former commander of the Armed Forces in Afghanistan, who's already out that against President Trump. In foreign policy,
thing for domestic protests. So there's a real line there. Let me also say that it's important to remember that 20% of the military is made up of about their particular topic, and they feel uncomfortable being put in a domestic policing role. As for the Bureau of Prisons, that might be a way for Barr to sort of try to marshal some people and please the president, but I wonder about the wisdom of that. We are currently in a federal prison lockdown that had started over COVID and now has been extended. And so to deploy resources from the from Bureau of Prisons at a time when the prisons are in lockdown may be unwise.
That is Jim Walsh, here now security analyst. Jim, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's turn to another big story, pandemic. More than a dozen states are seeing a daily increase of COVID-19 cases. Mississippi, Arkansas, and Arizona have hit records in new daily cases in just the last week, with numbers also rising in Tennessee. Dr. Jeannie Marazzo is director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and she's also part of the state's coronavirus task force. And doctor, what's happening right now with the coronavirus, specifically in the South?
So the South has been somewhat delayed in its experience of coronavirus, and I think that one thing people need to understand is that as the virus spreads, there are successive dynamic waves of transmission, and that's why we're seeing so much variability. So you saw the introduction largely on the West Coast and the Northwest, but very soon after in New York City and the Northeast, and then a gradual movement down to the Southeast, which is really where the burden of the U.S. experience is occurring right now. Even in the Southeast, we're seeing variations in pockets of intensity. So if you look at a state level, in a state like Alabama, for example, you can see that some of the counties that had the earliest outbreaks of infection are now experiencing a somewhat waning of that intensity, and other counties that are vulnerable are now coming on board and seeing a lot more infections.
You're saying that there's been a delay in spread in the South, and yet this also coincides with many of these states partially reopening. Can you talk about that dynamic for a moment?
Yes, if I could figure out that dynamic, I'd probably win some sort of major prize, because there are so many dynamic variables impacting what we are seeing as a somewhat superficial epidemiology of this virus. You not only have huge shifts in population mixing and mobility, right, as these physical distancing measures are modified. So that's a huge variable. On the second level, you've got just the virus doing its thing and, continuing to transmit at its usual pace. And at the third level, you have the dynamic of who's getting tested. So very, very difficult to be really confident in any big picture profiling of where this virus is going. And that's one of the reasons we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of months or the fall.
Speaking of that, especially in April, we were having lots of discussions about the impact on medical systems. I'm wondering, are you thinking that these increases are big enough to overload local medical systems? And what point do you think they should trigger a stop to the reopenings that we're seeing in some southern states?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and I can give you some specific examples. For example, here we have a 1,500 or so bed hospital, fairly large ICU, and with very good adherence to physical distancing in March through April, we were able to keep things pretty much under control. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now, despite that effort, is that we're having to take transfers from smaller cities like Montgomery, for example, that are experiencing a surge. The other dynamic with that, and this is true throughout the South, is that in the last decade plus, we have seen closures of many small rural hospitals. You have the situation of a very vulnerable population, lots of comorbidities, often remote, who don't have the local healthcare safety net that they need. They are then being brought to regional cities that have regional medical centers, which are then getting very much overloaded. So it's really going to be a question of monitoring the capacity of the referring and the referral hospitals very closely, and we're doing that on a day-by-day basis.
Dr. Anthony Fauci of the White House Coronavirus Task Force told the Journal of the American Medical Association this week that a coronavirus vaccine may not give long-term immunity. He said immunity from common coronavirus actually lasts about 3 to 6 months, almost always less than a year. Is too much hope being put on a vaccine?
I would agree with Dr. Fauci in that I think vaccine research is fraught with uncertainties, hope, and failure, and some success, right? So I think we've never really understood or intervened with coronavirus to create sustained immunity because, frankly, creating a vaccine for the common cold has not been a particularly high priority in the scientific research agenda. The good news about the coronavirus research program that's moving forward is that there are several that are called platforms for developing these vaccines. They're using different targets. So if things really get off the ground in the next 6 months, we should get some answers within the next year. And that's really what we need. It's really hard to say without the hard data.
That's Dr. Jeannie Milazzo. She's director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Doctor, thank you so much.
Thanks, my pleasure.
You're listening to Here and Now.
Protesters chant the name Breonna Taylor, and her aunts are processing what it means for their niece to become a national symbol.
You never would think that her name would be added to the hashtag. A hashtag. Nobody's safe. This can happen to Breonna. It can happen to anybody.
I'm Ari Shapiro, reporting from Louisville, Kentucky this afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Join us for All Things Considered ahead from 4 to 6:30 at WHYY. I'm Jack Lepiars. Mourners are gathering in Minneapolis today, the first in a series of remembrances for George Floyd around the country. The gathering at North Central University is being attended by the Reverend Al Sharpton. Floyd's body will then be taken to 3 other cities over the next 6 days. Virginia's governor says the state will remove a massive statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee as soon as possible. The announcement comes a day after Richmond's mayor said he would seek to have it and 4 other Confederate statues removed. The statue will be put into storage while authorities determine its fate. France is scaling back its planned Bastille Day parade from a military march to one honoring healthcare workers responding to the coronavirus pandemic. The country's president says thousands will still be able to attend the celebration, but will be requested to maintain physical distance. You're listening to Here and Now. At 1:19, you're listening to Here and Now on 90.9 WHYY, your NPR membership.
Supporting WHYY Nurse Partners Home Care, helping older adults living with any form of dementia, including Alzheimer's. Nurse Partners provides hands-on care throughout the disease progression while maintaining meaningful relationships. More at 610-323-9800.
You've been hearing stay safe for months, but how about stay sane? Sanity is at a pretty an insane time, and the news can make you dizzy. With WHYY, where you go to now for relaxed, fact-based stories that don't leave you more confused after listening. Use wisely.
Still ahead this hour on Here and Now, we'll hear from Bo Wynn, director of Be Water, a new ESPN documentary about the life of the late film star Bruce Lee.